Hello, hello, hello. Welcome back to another Voice for Freedom podcast, a podcast of Arise. Very, very happy to have a special guest today, and it's my pleasure to introduce Andrew Tucker. Andrew, before I even make introduction, thank you so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure, Simeon.
We really, really appreciate it. So, Andrew, you are an Australian international, a lawyer that's now based in Netherlands, and you're co-founder of Thinc, which is an acronym for the Hague Initiative for International Cooperation. So before we even jump into our discussion today, can you tell us a little bit more about Thinc?
So Thinc grew out of work that I've been doing for, I think, over 20 years. I'm an international lawyer by training. My career was in international commercial law. And I started getting involved in Israel-related issues about halfway through my career. And we realized fairly on, we're talking, 20 years ago, we could see this area of developing, particularly in Europe, how international law is playing an important role in defining the way that nations relate to Israel. Right? So everyone starts looking at the law to be like our barometer metric for deciding what we do with Israel. And it's only become more and more intensive. So we felt that there's a need for a kind of a dedicated think tank based in Europe, but with a global reach, to gather lawyers together and really start looking at this stuff. And as a Christian, we felt that we've done too little in this area. Actually, for decades, we've allowed the opposition to determine the agenda and to set the program, and we're now kind of catching up. And it's all around this use and misuse of the legal system to attack Israel. So it's not about being anti-Palestinian. It's not even about being pro-Israel, although we are pro-Israel. It's just about the right and appropriate use of law and legal systems to achieve a fair and a balanced outcome. Everybody wants a solution to this conflict. Israel's not going away. The Palestinians are not going away. But there is a conflict, and you don't resolve a conflict by misusing criminal law or other legal systems to demonize the opposition and to demonize Israel. We think that's not only unfair, but it's actually undermining the peace process.
Yeah. Wow. So there's a lot to unpack here. And I can already see layers of discussion that we could have around all of that. So I'm really, really looking forward to getting into that. I think there's no denial that, I guess in my thinking, any solution to this conflict is going to start with truth, which is a very hard thing for people to swallow these days. It doesn't even exist, and people have their truth and so on and so forth. And but I think just establishing what the truth is and the reality is on the ground, everything starts there and then sort of flows out of that. I do want to start with a very, very general question. I want to circle back to some of your work and what you're doing and just the topic of lawfare and how it's being used and all of that. But I want to open this because you're so engaged in this particular issue with a very general question, which is Israel committing genocide.
Wow, that's a really good question to jump straight into. So, well, that's what everybody says, right? So Amnesty's just come out with its report saying Israel is committing genocide. We have the UN Special Rapporteur for the Palestinian territories, Albanese. She's saying this every day. Human Rights Watch. So there's a whole bunch of people, UN organizations, and they say Israel is committing genocide. Interesting. It's a legal concept to start with, right? There is a convention, the Genocide Convention, which determines what the definition of genocide is. I think that's the place to start. So the definition of genocide is an act to destroy, in whole or in part, a group of people as such, whether it's a racial group or an ethnic or a national or religious group, but it's an act with the intention to destroy, and by destruction we mean physical destruction of a people. So think of the Armenian genocide, the Rwanda genocide. There's been a number. And some of these have come to the courts and some of them haven't. The Genocide Convention was after the Second World War. It was a response to the Holocaust, which is the genocide of genocides, of course. 6 million Jews killed because they were Jews. No doubt about that. So this frame is being used now to say that in the Gaza Strip, in the conflict since the 7th of October, Israel is committing genocide. South Africa has brought a claim to the ICJ, the International Court of Justice. That's the court that has jurisdiction under the convention to decide whether or not Israel is committing genocide. And to this very day, the court has not decided that Israel is committing genocide. There's been a series of preliminary proceedings from January last year onwards, and the court said, and this is the most famous one, everybody quotes it, the court said, well, it's plausible that the Palestinians have a right to be protected under the Genocide Convention. That's what the court said. Now, everybody says, well, the court has now decided it's plausible that Israel is committing genocide. And without being too legalistic about it, that's what the court did not say. And the president of the court appeared on the BBC later on to clarify. And part of the problem is these courts, almost by their nature, come out with very ambiguous findings. We might come back to this about the way the courts operate, because it in itself is problematic. But the president of the court said on the BBC, we specifically did not decide that Israel is committing genocide. We don't have the evidence. None of the parties have presented the evidence. So we're not in a position to, and we're not asked to. As everything the court has said since then has simply been to protect whatever rights the Palestinians have, and they clearly have rights under the convention, to make sure that genocide is not committed. So that's the first point. There's been no court ruling to say that Israel's committing genocide. So who decides? You know, it's very easy to make the claim, and I think this is the problem. It's a political claim rather than a legal one. Right. So if you do the hard work, if you analyze, let's take the Amnesty report as an example. It was very interesting. The report was published by Amnesty International, Amnesty's Israel branch. So Amnesty says they reached the conclusion that Israel is committing genocide, which is in itself problematic. This is a non-government organization pretending to do legal work. Well, of course, anybody can do legal work, but you're not a court of law, right? So you're not bound by the rules of evidence. You're not bound by judicial constraints. So they can make up anything they want. They can produce the evidence that they want, and there's nobody to, internally to say it's right or it's wrong. That's a very weak system. If you go through the report, which was produced by Amnesty International, Amnesty Israel came out with a statement at the same time, said, we don't like this report. We don't agree with it. We think this is a politically driven report. The report was produced as a result of a process where they already had decided Israel was committing genocide. They just wanted to write a report that justified their conclusion. And this is what a lot of the NGOs do, right? They want to accuse Israel of war crimes or crimes against humanity or whatever it is. So they produce these reports to justify their conclusions, which is the opposite of what courts do, courts of law. And that's why the legal process is so important. So Amnesty said no. Amnesty Israel said no, we don't think this is right. We don't agree with the conclusion. We don't agree with the way this was done. So we could see already the thing was being undermined. But they play around with the definition of genocide, which we'll talk about maybe in a moment. They play around with the evidence, and they pretend to come with conclusions. Any of us can do that. You can do it. I can do it. And we can pretend we're telling the truth. But that's why we have lawyers and legal processes to protect the findings of truth, legal truth and factual truth. And I think it's really problematic when these organizations, which are highly regarded, they have a lot of political clout, the media love them, they're quoted and they're cited all over the place, they're highly funded, like they have massive funding to do this stuff. So everybody thinks they're telling the truth, when basically it's a bunch of people sitting behind their desk listening to what a certain number of probably highly prejudicial people are saying, repeating the claims over and again. And it's like an echo chamber, and it becomes a kind of self-fulfilling truth. That's kind of the world we're living in. And I think the media play into this terribly. So that's a long answer to your question. I think, look, I don't know if Israel's committing genocide. I don't think they are, based on my observation. I don't see anybody who's really proved the case. And the core of genocide is the intention, right?
Right.
The laws of war provide very clear rules about what is justified in terms of killing people. Right? In wars, people are killed. That's what wars do. You're killing people. And we don't like it, but that's what's happening. So Israel is fighting a war against a bunch of organizations which are highly funded by Iran and others to annihilate the Jewish people and the state of Israel. They've gone into Gaza after 10 years of kind of mowing the lawn and trying to keep this thing under control. After October the 7th, they said, this is the end. We are going to get rid of Hamas and we're going to get our hostages back. To do that, we need to destroy Hamas. How do you destroy Hamas when they're embedded in tunnels underneath mosques and schools and medical facilities and all the rest of it? You've got to destroy a whole lot of infrastructure. And unfortunately, a lot of civilians are going to be killed. Hamas is embedded in Palestinian society. So it's a very complex situation. And to make the claim that Israel is intending to destroy the Palestinians as a people is a very, very powerful claim to be making. And it's all based on a bunch of statements that Bibi made or the president made or others, on or after the 7th of October, emotional statements, maybe unwise. But I don't think anybody's proved that the state of Israel has the intention and has acted on that intention to destroy the Palestinians as a people. They're destroying Hamas. And unfortunately, the Palestinian people have allowed Hamas to become very, a part of their social structure. This is another part of the problem. How do you distinguish between a civilian and a combatant is very, very hard.
Right. Well, yeah, especially when there aren't any uniforms as we understand it, and then also, of course, we know all of the numbers coming out of there, and so on and so forth. And I think it's safe to say that this war in Gaza is unprecedented on many levels, as far as what we understand as conventional warfare in today's world. You've got, of course, the use and really a strategy of human sacrifice. And what's fascinating to me about that is that it's proclaimed. They say it openly, and you can watch video after video of their leaders saying it. You can even watch their civilians saying it. We want to give our lives for this. We want to become martyrs. So you've got this very unusual, unprecedented situation, and then of course, on top of that, you have the global community engaging in this lawfare. And utilizing all of that to condemn Israel repeatedly over and over and over again. And I think and then of course essentially the city that's been built, the military city that's been built underneath Gaza, also unprecedented in history. How do you deal with that? How do you uproot it? I do want to ask a question that I don't hear asked very often. I know I might be throwing you some interesting questions, but you're the expert, and so we have you here. We've got to ask them.
Yeah.
Conversely, so we did ask the question, and thank you so much for sharing your opinion on whether or not, based on the evidence. So you're following a legal practice. You are a lawyer, and so that's the way you go about this, and thank goodness for that. But conversely, is Hamas guilty in word and deed of, whether successfully or not, but at least intentionality, committing genocide against Israel and Jews?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question. And with Hamas, I think those who are behind Hamas and supporting Hamas, so Iran particularly, and maybe Qatar as well. So, okay, well, let's come back to the definition of genocide. And I think one of the remarkable things, you look at the charter of Hamas, and it's all about it's not about liberation from the occupation. It's not about a two-state solution. It's not about territory. It's about killing Jewish people. It's very much a part of the ideology of Hamas, which, I mean, even the PLO charter goes in that direction, but it's a lot more moderate. But Hamas is highly extreme, and they say this all the time. As you said, their objective, and it's a form of religious intent to destroy a people. So I think there's clear evidence of intent on the part of Hamas. It's not only Hamas, by the way. I mean, it's Palestinian Islamic Jihad and other groups who are even more radical than Hamas. Then, so what are they doing? Well, the attack of the 7th of October, I suppose, would be the key piece of evidence you'd be looking at. And I was down there just a few weeks ago, and the thing that struck me about it was the highly sophisticated preparation for this attack. I mean, this was years in the making. I had kind of thought it was a little more random, but within a matter of minutes, these highly organized groups broke through the fence at different parts, and they strategically went into the kibbutzim and other areas, which they knew exactly where everybody was. They'd done their intelligence, and they went about the process of just killing people, not randomly, but and brutally. So there's a difference in the brutality as well. I mean, I know the images of Israel in Gaza are not good, and I'm sure there are instances where IDF soldiers have gone beyond what they should be doing. There's probably been cases of excessive use of force. That's definitely going to happen. But the thing about genocide, it's an institutional intention to do something. And that's where I think Hamas is different, because it's embedded in their psyche, in their whole reason for existence. And you come back to Islamic jihad and extremism, I think. It's a kind of ISIS ideology, which is about destroying the Jewish people as a people.
And it's interesting because what's so fascinating to me in the whole thing, and really perplexing, which just leads to a myriad of questions, is the fact that there's nothing covert about it. It's so overt. Literally, these groups and organizations proclaim openly, like you said, it's in their charters. And it's not just Hamas. Now, I was looking at the groups within the territory of Israel, but of course, if you broaden it out to Iran and all of its proxies, they're very, very clear on their stated intent, which really does speak to that intentionality that you're talking about, not only to destroy Israel and the Jewish people, and literally they say globally, like we want to kill all the Jews in the world, but also America, death to America. The intentionality is so clear. And so to me, it merits this question, this sort of this observation. I'm guessing you're familiar with a phrase called accusation in a mirror. I don't know if you're familiar with that phrase, which was really a strategy, if I understand it correctly, that was initiated by Goebbels, under the Nazi regime, which was accusing the target specifically of genocides of exactly what you intend to do to them. It's the ultimate form, if you would, of gaslighting. And what's so interesting to me is that you've now got these governmental bodies and mainstream media that seem to be playing a significant role in that process. So that, you've got Israel, who's doing everything they can to minimize civilian casualties. And as you said, of course, I'm sure there are isolated incidents where things go too far, whatever the case may be, which I think is also, any student of history or war or anything understands that's pretty typical of any type of combat situation and just warfare in general, nature of the beast, if you would, which it doesn't necessarily excuse it, but it does explain it. All of that being said, how did we get to where we are today in terms of the use of lawfare? And to me, when I look at the whole thing, I think some of the greatest danger in the situation that we're facing with regard to lawfare is not so much the ability to bring evidence forth that produces a conviction and therefore a sentence, if you would, the way that we understand law, but really it's being used as a tool to persuade the masses, as I see it. Like you said, the politicization of judicial systems, to me, seems like a tool that's being used to sway public opinion. And I think the World War III, as we're seeing it, is really one of public opinion. That's the battlegrounds that we're all sort of fighting in these days. We're heavily engaged with it at Arise. But can you talk more to that? What is going on? I think a lot of our viewers, we can see what's happening, but we don't necessarily understand the reasons why. For instance, why such bias in these governmental bodies? Can you speak to that a little bit more? Why are we seeing this strategy of accusation in a mirror and the participation of groups like the UN and the ICC?
Right. Well, it's a very complex question. And I think you kind of got to break it down. You see it at a national level, you see it at an international level. Even if just looking at the Netherlands as an example, or Australia, where I come from, since the 7th of October, we've seen this kind of explosion, haven't we, of anti-Semitism and this sort of mass accusation against Israel. It was already on the 7th of October. I think it was within 24 hours, people were accusing Israel of committing genocide.
Right. Before they ever responded.
They didn't even respond.
It was 2 weeks before they did anything.
Right. So there was already this idea, Israel is the oppressor. Israel is the one that is already committing genocide. That's what Albanese, the UN special rapporteur, she said, look, you've got to go way back to 45, 48, even before. The whole Israel existence is a commission of genocide. Right? The Jews came and they destroyed the Palestinians, or tried to, and take the land away from them. So I think that's underlying it. It's right. Like the Jews just shouldn't even be there. It seems to me. And a lot of people, I think, subliminally have that idea. They struggle with the idea of the existence of a Jewish state. And I think that feeds very much into it, certainly on the liberal left side. The very woke ideology. People don't know their history. They really don't. They only know what they read on Instagram or whatever. That's so we have a generation. Even my own kids living in the Netherlands, they didn't even study the Holocaust. So it's like we have a generation, they don't know what the world looked like before 1990 or something.
Right. For grunge rock.
Yeah, right. So that's one side. Then I think you have the demographics of the Muslim world, the Islamic world, and the element of fear. People are afraid to criticize Islam. Nobody wants to criticize the Islamic world. The fear of discrimination. You're going to be brought before the courts. You'll have them on your doorstep. So there's that element as well. And you have this very strange kind of alliance between the left on the one side and Islamic extremism on the other side, playing into the demonization of Israel and the Jewish people. So you kind of had like that at a societal level. And this also plays out at the institutional level at the UN, which is, again, where all of this feeds into the court system. The UN is is a just a bunch of states who get together and talk about stuff. And, when the majority of those states are very hateful of Israel, then the things that they say tend to be rather extreme. So we have all these resolutions coming out of the UN which demonize Israel, accuse Israel, and quite deliberately using the terminology that the West created as a response to the Holocaust. I mean, it's the human rights system which the Jewish people basically created to protect themselves against dictatorships and fascism, is now being used against them by their enemies, precisely in this mechanism I think that you've described. So they play that game very, very carefully and very well. And so you're using genocide and apartheid and colonialism and all the other terminology that you can think of, creating this sense of the Jewish people are just inherently evil. They just shouldn't be there. So I think that's kind of what happens. And then
it seems so deliberate from my perspective.
Well, it is deliberate. It's
literally
totally
these
deliberate.
things couldn't be further from the truth. For those of us that have spent significant amounts of time in Israel, have lived there, you can't live in Israel and not, if you throw a stone in any direction, you're going to hit a piece of archaeology with Hebraic writing on it, Hebrew symbols, so on and so forth. You've got an 1,800-year-old mosque built on top of a 3,000-year-old temple. So that, there's the historicity of it. But then just the modern day Israel is so clearly not an apartheid nation, as demonstrated on every level of society. 20% of the society are Arab Muslims that serve in our governmental system, including our Supreme Court. We have judges on the Supreme Court. It literally couldn't be further from the truth, which just demonstrates to me the deliberate nature of all this, which is so perplexing. And I guess one of the questions that I have is how much of this is driven by money? Are these, it's when you look at how bizarre and strange what's happening at the UN, for instance, is. Just take one organization where this is an organization that is committed to human rights. And as you said, they're afraid of offending any people group, Muslims, but you said Muslims specifically, who many, at least the radical leaning factions, we know that that's not the totality of Islam, right? So let that be said and understood. But the radical factions of it literally say clearly that they value death more. They're going to win because they value death more than Israel values life. So these are the people that you're looking to determine what human rights should be. And this fear of not offending them, which to me is actually a significant form of discrimination. I think that the notion that Palestinians can't do any better is extremely discriminatory and racist.
I agree.
Why are they different than any other people group on the planet that can change, can grow, can learn, move away from barbarism, all these different things? The notion that they're stuck in this place is, to me, both racist and discriminatory on every level. But when I look at it, just coming back to that question, how much, in your opinion, is money behind all this? We talked to an expert yesterday that used a phrase that I had not heard before, which is, take Qatar, for instance, is basically a bank with an agenda. And I thought that was seemed pretty accurate to me. How much of what we're seeing, because it makes no sense whatsoever, is driven by money?
Look, I think at the end of the day, a lot of it is about interests, and money reflects interests, very much so. I mean, just look at the way Europe has approached it. So Europe is the one that's most committed to sort of perpetuating this idea of Palestinian victimhood, and they have a right, kind of like an absolute right to statehood. They have a right to everything, according to the Europeans. And all of that came out of the period really between 1967 and 1980. So you had the Six-Day War, Right up to 1967, I think most Western countries, Europeans certainly, were behind the state of Israel, its existence, its right to exist. And then all of a sudden, Six-Day War, Israel took a lot of territory, including the Sinai, was in a position of power. And things started to change. And then we had the Yom Kippur War in October 1973. And to my mind, that was the turning point. And we had the Arab oil boycott. And Europe suddenly realized they were in a really bad place economically and financially. They needed Arab oil. So my understanding of that period is they did a deal with the Arab world, which is purely about self-interest, to make sure they would get access to Arab oil. And the price to be paid was basically twofold. They said, we will open our borders to immigration from the Middle East. And we saw the beginning of mass immigration from mainly the Islamic world. We will open our universities to Islamic teaching. We will accept money from the Arab world. And we will support the Palestinian cause. And that's the beginning of this whole two-state mantra. Everybody knows that's going nowhere. So they overlooked the 100-year history of, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, who propagated the Hebron massacre in 1929. Every opportunity the Palestinians have had to reach peace, they have rejected. As has been said, the Palestinians never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. And we've perpetuated that. We've kept them in that position, this refugee system. And I think at the end of the day, it's all about the self-interest of states, which is largely an economic one, unfortunately. We don't dare to confront the uncomfortable truth. And having said that, a lot of money is going around. I've done a lot of work, for example, with Pacific Islands. Now, it used to be Gaddafi in Libya. Now it's Qatar. They throw a lot of money at these states. And one of the conditions for getting their money is that they're going to vote in the UN in a certain way. Votes are traded literally in the UN. And those with the money have a lot to say. China is doing the same thing, of course. So
okay, so that leads to some other questions. So we have this turnover of regimes, if you would. Not that we use that term so much in the Western world, but here in the United States, for instance, with the current administration coming in and seeming, at least by what they say, they seem to have intentions to make some changes here on all of these different things.
Really?
Trump, right? So Trump, I think it was just a couple of days ago, announced that he was going to sanction heavily the ICC, et cetera, et cetera. Thank you so much, by the way, for laying out sort of the historicity of that and the motivation behind it, because I think everyone's struggling to understand why. The truth seems so blaring, but why such bias coming out of these? And I think it is important to understand the history behind all of it and how we got to this place. If you were to advise the Trump administration coming in on how to address this, how do we bring real and meaningful change at the UN, at the ICC, or are they just too far gone at this point? Do we just start to defund and dismantle? What is the solution to this problem, in your opinion?
Right. Well, the first thing I suppose is to identify what the problem is, and there is a problem. There really is. It's a structural one. There's a problem with the sort of one state, one vote system in the UN, whereby there's always this automatic majority in the General Assembly. So I think the General Assembly is a problem. The way it functions, and it plays down into all these. So the General Assembly creates a lot of these other UN institutions. One of them is UNRWA, the refugee system. And look, I tend to think at the end of the day, the only way to address this, we've been tinkering around at the edges. You might remember the Human Rights Council was radically reformed. Was the Human Rights Commission radically reformed, replaced by the Human Rights Council? It's no better than it was. So reforming it apparently doesn't really work. I think you've just got to take some pretty radical action. And to my mind, let's take UNRWA, I think is a really good example. You have an organization which is massively funded to keep the Palestinians as perpetual refugees, and allowed an educational system based on hatred of Israel and the Jewish people, infiltrated by Hamas, etc., etc. It's all been documented. We know it's the case. I don't think you can expect UNRWA to reform itself. The UN General Assembly is not going to reform it simply because of the bias within the Assembly. So it's going to come down to states like the United States, take Argentina as well, say, look, guys, we've been funding you for years. We're going to stop. And we're going to do something completely different. And that's what I don't know how it's all going to play out, but I think Trump's perhaps one of the few people who's got the ability and the courage to take this kind of action. And it's this is a very anti-globalist perspective. As soon as you say this sort of thing, people will accuse you of being opposed to the international legal order. If you attack the ICC, you're attacking a judicial institution. We don't like to do that because courts, we should protect them and they should be independent. But I think this court has gone down the wrong track. It's become a very politicized body. And to be issuing arrest warrants against Israeli leaders, I think is just the classic example of how biased it has become.
How unprecedented is that, for instance? With all of the, if you just take a crosscut of the leaders across the Middle East and their actions and what they're doing, how unprecedented is it bringing, these cases against these Israeli leaders?
Well, look, of course, so the ICC's brought cases before. It's issued arrest warrants, obviously, because people have been, charged and brought before the court. But it's the first case of bringing accusations, let alone arrest warrants, against Western leaders. So that's the first thing to note. And a country fighting a war of self-defense in a region full of dictatorships. And, how is it that Assad manages to ensconce himself in Moscow with a bank account of billions of dollars? And the ICC says it's all about, removing immunity and making sure that, war criminals are pursued. Well, they should go after the real war criminals. And the problem is that, Syria is not a member of the court. Russia is not a member of the court. The United States is not a member of the court. Israel is not a member of the court. So it shouldn't be going after Israeli leaders. Palestine is not a state. And yet they've created this kind of quasi-state that's become a member of the court. So the very basis of the court's jurisdiction is highly pretentious. It's totally ludicrous. And yet they're using it to go after Israeli leaders. So, and that is all the influence of the Arab states on the court. And at the risk of sort of touching on a very sensitive topic, but we have an Islamic prosecutor. It's not about anti-Islam, but we also have an Islamic president of the International Court of Justice, and they are influenced by their own worldview. It's inevitable. And I think Karim Khan is an excellent lawyer. I'm not disputing his legal capacity, but he's making political decisions and he's allowing himself to be influenced, I think, by states that are hostile to the state of Israel.
Thank you so much for sharing that. So, in addition to defunding UNRWA, which I think,
Yeah.
it seems probably pretty likely based on, of course, Trump's first term and the actions that he took at that time, and certainly,
Mm.
I couldn't agree more that that needs to happen for all of the obviously obvious reasons. Um, what other specific steps, when with regard to the ICC, for instance, what do you think? I know that Trump is threatening sanctions. Are there other steps that could be taken to sort of rein this in, bring it back in check? Or again, I don't hear you saying with regard to the UN in general, the General Council, and also with the ICC that you feel like they should be disbanded, for instance. I don't hear you saying that necessarily, or is that the case? If I'm the Trump administration, what specific steps can I take to sort of change this situation?
Yeah. Well, funding is clearly the most powerful tool that you have. Sanctions, obviously, any sanction that the United States imposes has far-reaching effects. I do think the UN is a deeply problematic institution, but the question is, what's the alternative? We need some kind of system of governance at a global level. But I think we have to get away from the idea that, world peace and security is going to be guaranteed by some bunch of bureaucrats sitting in New York or wherever else. At the end of the day, it comes down to the interaction of states amongst themselves. So, pretty much every system that we've had has been problematic and by definition flawed. Most humanly created systems, they're not perfect, but you've got to have checks and balances in place, and we don't have those sufficiently. That's the problem with international organizations generally. You don't have the checks and balances that you have at a national level for different reasons. And I don't see why the United States should be the one that is always funding all of these institutions, which have become inherently anti-Western. They're undermining the values that we have built our Western society upon. And I would say, as Western states, it's time to review the whole, really. And every state, not just the United States, but we all have a responsibility in that. And the primary way of doing it is to, turn off the funding and force people to come up with something different, something better. And now it doesn't mean destroying the UN as a whole, because you've got to do something, I think, gradually. But it took the Second World War really to dismantle the League of Nations and replace it with the UN. And sometimes you need a catastrophe to create change. And if there's one thing Trump is good at, is a disruptor.
No question about that. It seems like it's the pendulums. There seem to be swinging pendulums right now, globally, and particularly, I would say, in the West. And I think, certainly Western politics factors into these decisions significantly as well, because the moment that you begin to start talking about defunding groups like the UN or the ICC, or even threatening sanctions, as a Western politician, you are immediately accused of being a dictator by people in your own country, by the more left leaning, and not wanting peace with other countries, and so on and so forth. So it's very, very complex issues, but I do think that might cater well to Trump's style. He doesn't seem to be easily bullied by the other side, and in fact, I would say, based on the statements he's made even over the last few days, it's hard to know with Trump how much of it is strategy, communicative strategy, or how serious he is about renaming the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America, or, for instance, America taking over Greenland. I'm sure you're heard these interesting statements. But I think certainly it would be safe to say that we do have a window of time right now within which to work. And I think it seems to me, based on something that you just said, because I've been saying this for years, just looking at the erosion of our society here in the United States, what's it going to take? You reach these certain points as a society and you wonder, what's it going to take to get us back on course, if it's even possible? And I've said that one thing that would probably do it here in our country would be a threat on a domestic attack or threat. Does seem to be a wake-up call. I do wonder if we do have a window of time within which to work. It seems like there's this swinging pendulum back a little bit towards more, at least, a moderate perspective. And I just wonder if it's kind of like, hey, is this window our last chance before the only thing that'll save us is that attack on domestic soil, an existential threat, if you would. And I don't think we're far away from that either, probably, based on having open borders for the last 4 years and tens of millions of people coming in. And we're actually already seeing that, but not on a grand level, if you would. Anyway, I took a pile of rabbit trails right there.
No, I think so. In a way, we're kind of circling back to where we started. It's just, look, what is the bottom line? What are we actually fighting for? What is at stake? And you said, truth is at stake. I think that's true, but in a sense, I also think that it's the sense of good and evil. And funnily, Trump intuitively has this kind of sense of, what is good and what is not good. And he's going to fight for it. He may be right or may be wrong in his judgment, but there's this idea there's something worth fighting for. And it's our system, it's our values, it's our identity. And at the end of the day, this is why I think where Israel and the Jewish people come in, because they are the source of our whole understanding of what is right and wrong, what is good and what is bad. And if you lose a sense that there is good in the world and there is evil, once you let go of that sort of dichotomy, then, and that's the problem with the left, there is no good and evil anymore. So you can't distinguish. And so you lose all ability to fight for what is right. And now people don't like that, of course, because it sort of smacks of supremacy and, nationalism, and we don't want to go down the fascism route. We don't want. So there is always that risk. I get that. But I do think at the West, we're at the point where we have to decide, what do we really stand for? And that concerns me when I look at a country like Australia or a lot of European countries. We're not so sure anymore, really, what it is that we're fighting for.
That would be interesting to drill down on that, some layers too. And I think when you eliminate truth, there's truth, but then there's also perspectives on the truth, right? And I think people conflate those things today, right? So you have to start from the point that there is truth. You may have a different perspective or understanding or even view of it than I do, but there should be a basic understanding that there is truth, and we can find it if we try hard enough. I think when you eliminate that completely, and I think what we're seeing a lot of in today's world, I think you're left with nothing but nihilism at that point, to some degree, and which is a dangerous and slippery slope, and somewhere we don't want to go as a society. I think it's clear. But I want to circle back really quickly to Australia. Wow. It is. Yeah, I've had the pleasure of being there, and it is really, really wonderful. I've been in the outback, and I actually saw a platypus in the wild one time, which is something that most Australians can't even boast. But what is going on? And how alarmed are you as an Australian for your people? It seems that once Jews are being attacked and anti-Semitic, just historically, once there's significant discrimination towards Jews in a society, it seems like you're not too far from decline. And how alarmed are you by what you're seeing in Australia? And can you just speak to that a little bit right now?
Yeah, look, I'm very concerned because I've just been there. I got back last weekend and spoke with a lot of Jewish people, and there's a lot of fear. There's a lot of worry. Ever since the 7th of October, there's been like an explosion of anti-Semitism. You've seen it, Sydney Opera House and all the rest of it. And it's not just the physical attacks; it's the whole kind of atmosphere. And a sense that the government has been completely weak and unable. We have a very weak government, must be said, very left wing. I think it's been Australia's always had a very strong bipartisan support of Israel. So we have two basic parties like the UK, a Labour Party and a Conservative Party, but they've always agreed on supporting Israel until this one. This one has completely let that go. So Penny Wong, a foreign minister, she's been absolutely outrageous in my view. But I don't think she represents all of Australians.
Yeah, that was my next question, kind of, because, one of the things that I feel like we see in these sort of across the board in a lot of these countries, in Canada and the United States, what makes the news isn't necessarily the general perspective of society as a whole. And I know that Australia has a rich history of supporting Israel. In fact, I read a book some years ago. It's been a long time, so I probably won't do it justice, but it had to do with sending horsemen. There were some horsemen from Australia, and you probably know the story, and I think they came and helped Israel during their War of Independence, if I'm not mistaken. Am I getting that right?
Well, there've been various things, but the most famous one is the Battle for Beersheba in 1917.
Okay, maybe that's the one thing. Was that when they sent the cavalry or whatever it was?
31st of October, the Australian horsemen took Beersheba, opened the way for General Allenby to take Jerusalem and liberate Jerusalem from the Turks. So we've been right in there in both world wars, and we've given our lives for the creation of the
state. So is what we're seeing in Australia right now with this rise of anti-Semitism, is that just fringe groups, in your opinion, that are getting a lot of publicity, which seems to be what we're seeing all over the world, but not so much the sentiment of the general public?
No, I think they are. I'm not sure they're fringe. They're sort of extreme groups, but unfortunately, they're very influential. But it is definitely a minority, but a very strong one, a very outspoken, very aggressive one. And it's this strange alliance again of the Islamist radicals with the left wing, woke. They're the ones parading through the streets of Melbourne and Sydney and so forth. But nobody, if you don't have a government that's willing to clamp down, if you don't have a police force that's willing to enforce the law, then you have a problem. So it's becoming a little bit institutionalized. And it's partly because our legal system, everybody's afraid of doing anything that's going to undermine the rights of these groups, because they will fight back. They will take everybody to the courts, and they're well funded. So there's an element of fear as well. And the demographics of Australia have changed significantly over the last 2 or 3 decades. And I think that there's much less of a sense of what it is to be Australian than there used to be. So like we have Australia Day in January, which celebrates the British coming and creating the modern country of Australia. Well, we don't like that anymore because we actually wiped out the Indigenous people, which really did happen, unfortunately. So there's now a sense that we don't want to celebrate Australia Day anymore because we're ashamed of our own history, which raises the question of, well, what are we? What defines our core identity. And the Jewish people have played a significant role in Australia, very important ones. Many of our leaders have been Jewish, and they've created an amazing country. And it's those Jewish people now who are feeling very, very afraid.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
Well, it sounds very, very similar to what's happened here in the United States over the last decades. So it seems like we're all kind of in this boat together and fighting for truth and also trying to discern what it is. And there is sort of a shaking that's happening globally.
Very much so.
Well, as we're winding down here, do you have any closing thoughts that you'd like to share with us? And how, our audience tends to be people that really want to engage in advocacy. And we're watching these things unfold. And, so many people, what do I do? How do I help? How do I get involved? What would you say to people that want to get involved with your work and what you're doing? Because there's no question that we need to see checks and balances. In the very least, that would be the first step, would be seeing checks and balances brought into the UN and the ICC. What would you say to people that want to get involved?
Well, I think what we really want and need is a kind of a reasonable and a balanced kind of debate and discussion about these issues. We live in a world of social media where everything's about sound bites, and somehow we need to get away from that. It's very hard because that's the world we live in. But if people can be encouraged to engage in a rational kind of discussion, I think that's what needs to happen at the level of our governments and civil society leadership. And that means being on top of the information, the facts and the arguments. So that's what we try and do as an organization, is to kind of equip people with that in the limited way that we can. So use our resources, and many other organizations doing excellent work in this field. Unfortunately, the information is a little disparate. It's hard to sort of go to one place and get all the information you need on one topic. You've got to be willing to go out there and look and find. But we're there for people. We would like to be a place where people, if you have questions, reach out to us.
How do people do that?
So we have our website, Thinc, Thinc-Israel.org or think.info. You can get to our website. You'll find us on social media. We're not as strong on social media as we'd like to be.
I follow you guys, just so you know.
Right. Okay, that's good.
You guys put out some really good stuff, actually, and we're heavily engaged in social media warfare, if you would, at Arise. We have a Turning the Tide project that we're heavily engaged with. But I've definitely enjoyed a lot of your content.
Well, I think we're very much a content kind of focused organization. So we will never be, right on top of social media. But if we can help others in that space, then that's what we'd like to do. We're an organization of experts and people who, think and write about these issues and talk about them. So reach out to us, use us. If you've got questions, ask them. I don't know if you can, on this video, just put our email address.
Absolutely.
Might be helpful. Yeah, web address.
Love it. And Simone will reach out to you after this, and get all of that information from you. Make sure that we're sharing that. Well, as we're winding down here, Andrew, thank you so much for taking the time to meet with us and delve into these very, very complex and nuanced subjects. I know you've been a trooper. I know I've asked some hard questions, but thank you so much. And for those of you watching, please do look up Thinc, and the work that they're doing is significant. If you, like me, agree that there need to be changes and reforms taking place at the UN and at the ICC, this is an organization that you want to be involved with and tracking. And if you want to just know what's going on and being in the know, you want to track with Thinc. So thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to meet with us. Once again, Voice for Freedom podcast. Check us out at ariseforisrael.com. Check out our social media. We're out there everywhere. Just look up Arise. Thank you so much and have a fantastic day.